Plagues. They've haunted human history since the earliest civilizations, an unwelcome companion to our collective story. But long before the medieval Black Death, ancient peoples from Mesopotamia to Rome recorded their own terrifying epidemics that decimated populations, upended wars, and confounded the wisdom of the sages. So imagine the dread and confusion in a Bronze Age city as a mysterious illness spreads, or the shock in classical Athens when an unseen scourge kills citizens by the thousands within weeks. In the ancient world, disease was often perceived as divine punishment or even demonic wrath. Yet these societies bravely faced it and developed surprisingly practical responses, from public rituals to quarantine-like measures, doing everything they could to cope with the waves of pestilence. So what we are going to do today is go through the major plagues of antiquity across different regions of the world, and in doing so, we'll draw upon the voices of the time, along with more modern archaeological evidence, to reveal how these early epidemics were experienced and, of course, the consequences they wrought. But of course, let me give you first a warm welcome. If you've not hit that subscribe button yet, I advise you to do so. And I would like to thank the members on Patreon and YouTube and those who chose to donate. It helps keep the channel going and keep everything 100% ad-free. And thank you to those who took the opportunity to check out the merch store as well. Links to all of those just mentioned will be in the pinned comment and the video description. But now, without further delay, let's sink into the depravity again and go back to the ancient world. Well, we better start from the oldest recorded plagues, and they emerged from the ancient Near East. There was perhaps plagues before then, but when we talk about recorded, ancient writing is pretty much all in that area. Well, of course, the system of cuneiform scripts put onto those clay tablets certainly last the test of time. They allow such catastrophes to be documented in a good amount of detail. We turn to Mesopotamia. Disease was often associated with the will of the gods. For instance, the Mesopotamians worshipped a god called Nergal, among many others, of course, a deity associated with plague and death, and they believed that epidemics were one of his punishments upon humanity. Still, beyond the mythic explanation, we find more pragmatic measures against contagion, surprisingly early in history. We have one letter, actually, from the 18th century BCE, discovered in the archives of Mari, that is, a city on the Euphrates River, and it reveals an ancient awareness of contagion. The king, Zimri Lim, instructs his wife to isolate a palace servant who fell ill, ordering that no one drink from the cup where she drinks, and no one sit on the seat where she sits. Well, precautions like this, essentially early quarantine measures, they show us that even 4,000 years ago, people recognized the person-to-person spread of deadly disease. The fact that this advice was taken seriously at a royal court shows that epidemics were a known threat, requiring active intervention. Now, of course, this does not mean that this is the first ever instance. It's just the first recorded instance that we have. And yes, I know it's remarkably early, 1800, but of course we had plagues before then. It's just people were not writing them down yet. One of the most significant early plague episodes actually struck the Hittite Empire in the late Bronze Age. The Hittites, based in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, recorded in their chronicles that a devastating plague entered their land during the reign of King Suppiluliuma I in the 14th century. According to surviving cuneiform tablets, this epidemic was brought back by Hittite soldiers who had been off campaigning in Egyptian territories. Captives or treasure taken during a war apparently harbored the disease, and once it spread in the Hittite heartland, well, it proved to be catastrophic. King Suppiluliuma I, a formidable conqueror, with a formidable name, by the way, I sometimes struggle with that one, fell ill, and he died. The plague got him, as did his immediate successor, Arnuwanda II. Essentially, the plague had wiped out a generation of the royal family, showing that no one was safe, from king to peasant. But the new king, Mursili II, was left with a traumatically reduced court. Well, what was he going to do? Well, in response, Mursili performed what might be called plague liturgy. He actually composed a series of plague prayers, fervent supplications to the gods, begging for mercy to please end the scourge. Well, these prayers, preserved on clay tablets and recovered at the Hittite capital of Hattusa, describe the plague's toll and attribute it to divine anger, possibly because of a past sin by the former king. It's a pretty intimate glimpse of a monarch grappling with a public health disaster in spiritual terms. Mercilessly confesses any unknown offenses and promises reparations to the gods, trying everything to appease them so that the deadly disease might finally relent. The plague ultimately lasted about 20 years, suggesting an endemic presence that the Hittites could not easily eradicate. But this combination of dynastic deaths and prolonged depopulation certainly helped to weaken Hittite power, and it shows how a microscopic pathogen could succeed where an army could not. Well, we did mention Egypt once, so how about we pop down to Egypt now? It's only a little bit south of Hattusa anyway. But they too knew the terror of the plague, though the records are a little bit more fragmentary. An intriguing modern hypothesis, based on both medical texts and archaeological evidence, suggests that around 1715 BCE, a virulent epidemic struck Egypt's northeastern delta. The outbreak reportedly began in the busy port city of Avaris, Egypt's gateway to the Near East. Avaris at that time was a pretty cosmopolitan trade hub. Later it was the actual capital of the Hyksos rulers. Well, of course, that would have been vulnerable to diseases introduced via merchants and soldiers. A lot of cross-contamination, people passing to and from. The epidemic is thought to have been so severe that one ancient Egyptian account described it as if the world was coming to an end. Although the exact disease is uncertain, researchers have suggested that it might have been tularemia. No, don't worry, I didn't know what it is either, so I looked it up. It's kind of a bacterial illness that can spread from animals to humans. It's not quite Yersinia pestis, but it can certainly cause plague-like symptoms. Archaeologists have found mass burial sites and even a layer of lime, that is a kind of disinfectant, covering human remains in Egyptian excavation, a context that could correspond to this time period. In a funerary complex in Thebes, for example, excavation revealed hastily buried bodies with a thick coating of lime and evidence of bonfires where infected corpses were burned, a dramatic attempt to halt contagion in the wake of a deadly epidemic. These findings certainly align with descriptions of devastating pestilence, and it indicates that the Egyptian authorities took extreme measures, bypassing normal funerary customs to dispose of plague victims, essentially creating ancient plague pits and disinfection protocols. It's also pretty tempting to see echoes of this mystery of Egyptian plagues in later literature, and quite easy to speculate it might dimly underlie the biblical tale of the plagues of Egypt in Exodus. Those famous 10 plagues, including pestilence on cattle, boils on people, are a religious memory rather than a strict historical record, sure, but they do demonstrate how deeply disease was associated with divine punishment in ancient thought. Similarly, there's another biblical account, the outbreak of tumors and illness among the Philistines after seizing the Ark of the Covenant. It might preserve a folk memory of an epidemic in Iron Age Canaan. In that story, the Philistines returned the captured Ark, along with the golden images of rats and tumors as guilt offerings. An intriguing detail, since rats, as you know, would later be linked to plague transmission in the bubonic plagues of the Common Era. While we must be a little cautious about reading legend as history and history as legend, such texts suggest that communities in ancient Egypt and the Near East had a long-standing cultural narrative to make sense of the sudden mass sickness that they occasionally faced. Of course, the ancient world puts everything into its own terms. It's up to us to make sense of it in the modern era. Now, by the Iron Age, that is the first millennium BCE, larger empires kept official chronicles that sometimes noted epidemics. The Neo-Assyrian Empire provides a striking example of how plagues could intertwine with politics. The Assyrian royal eponym lists record that in the year 765, a plague occurred in the land, and again in 759, another one. These outbreaks were severe enough that the normal state functions had to go on pause for a whole year. The Assyrian king did not go on his annual military campaign because of it either. The empire was also racked by internal revolts in the aftermath, as 763 to 58, and later historians conjectured that the trauma of disease, combined with a rare solar eclipse seen as an evil omen, fueled unrest among a population fearing divine wrath. In Assyrian ideology, the king was the high priest of the war god, Ashur, and he was expected to ensure the god's favor. A plague and an eclipse, back to back. Well, that would have been perceived as an enormous divine anger. The priest is not doing his job. What is telling that shortly after these events, Assyria entered a period of comparative decline, at least until strong rulers could restore order, but that's a task in itself. Plague, eclipse, revolt. It reads like a scene from an ancient apocalypse, and indeed later generations may have drawn inspiration from this convergence of disasters. Think about the Hebrew prophet Jonah's tale of warning Nineveh, perhaps an inspiration. So really, the ancient Near East and Egypt furnish the earliest plague narratives, and they're characterized by a mix of religious interpretation and practical action. On one hand, the texts that we have, at least the ones that we've translated and pulled out of the ground so far, emphasize appeasing gods thought to be afflicting disease, and on the other we see concrete measures like isolating the sick, burning corpses, applying disinfectants like lime. The outcomes were equally far-reaching. Plagues toppled kings, halted wars, stirred social turmoil. They became part of a cultural memory, etched in clay tablets and papyrus, both historical fact and a moral lesson. And who knows, maybe over in those linear A and linear B script-using societies, perhaps once we translate them, they will tell their own stories of plagues. We just don't know yet. Fingers crossed we'll figure out more and I have to remake this video in 10 years' time or something for all the lovely new information we have. Well, of course, they're not all just about the Near East and Egypt. The ancient world's a lot bigger than that. Themes of the plague would resonate in other civilizations as well. So let's move on to South and East Asia and have a look at their experiences. While the ancient Near East was grappling with Bronze Age epidemics, the civilizations of South Asia and East Asia, well, they weren't immune to the specter of plague either. However, the documentation of ancient epidemics in these regions is a little sparser and often blended with legend or later recording. But don't worry, there's still important clues about how early societies in India and China confronted widespread diseases. Let's start with India. One of the earliest references to a plague-like epidemic comes from Buddhist literature, rather than any royal annals. The Ratana Sutta, a Buddhist scripture in the Pali language, describes an outbreak of disease and famine in the city of Vaisali, present-day Vaishali in Bihar, during Buddha's lifetime, traditionally dated to the 5th century BCE. The city was said to be afflicted by a devastating plague that caused many deaths. According to the account, the Buddha's response was to have his disciple Ananda recite the Ratana Sutta while walking through the city, sprinkling water as a blessing. Well, guess what? Miraculously, as the story goes, the epidemic subsided thereafter. This event was so famed that the Ratana Sutta came to be used as a protective chant in the Theravada Buddhist communities, a kind of spiritual prophylactic, I suppose. Well, although modern historians treat this miraculous element with quite a bit of understandable skepticism, the story does show the real aspect of ancient Indian responses to the plague, the use of ritual and charity. It is said that Vaisali's people, guided by the Buddha, not only performed recitations but also improved sanitation, disposing of unburied corpses, that is, and also giving alms to appease spirits. Indian texts often conflate epidemics with divine or demonic forces. For example, attributing smallpox to the wrath of the goddess Shitala in later folklore. But they also include early forms of medical knowledge. Ayurvedic treatises, like the works of Susruta, that is 1st millennium BCE, recognized contagious diseases and advised isolation of patients and fumigations of homes with medical smoke. So, kind of similar to the Near East, ancient India had a sort of dual approach. Empirical precautions alongside these spiritual remedies. Well, let's move east now, to ancient China, and we find that imperial histories dutifully noted outbreaks of disease, though often a little tersely. The Chinese concept of disease was tied to the mandate of heaven. Natural disasters and epidemics could be interpreted as signs that a ruler had lost heaven's favor. Thus, court chronicles would report epidemics almost as a formality, sometimes without detail, but just enough to indicate that they were a recurring challenge. For example, let's look at the Han Dynasty, especially in the later days. There were several significant epidemics in that time. Chinese records tell us that around 161 to 171 CE, a series of deadly outbreaks struck the Han Empire. One especially lethal episode in 162 hit the army camps in the western provinces of the Han realm. It was noted that in some garrisons, up to 40% of the soldiers perished. This cluster of epidemics in the 160s to 70s is remarkably close in the time to the great Antonine Plague happening in the Roman Empire, and don't worry, we'll get to it. In fact, some scholars have wondered if it was the same pandemic, possibly smallpox, traveling along that Old Silk Road. It bought a lot more than silk, unfortunately. Chinese accounts mention that after 166 CE, strange diseases were widespread. By one report, outbreaks recurred almost every year up to 179. The Han dynasty was already under strain from corruption and rebellion. The Yellow Turban Revolt had broke out in 184, and the toll of pestilence just added to the chaos. One Han official lamented that in the wake of the epidemic, there were not enough living to bury the dead in some regions. Well, that gives you a bit of a picture of how bad things were. China's quite famous for having these huge disasters where millions upon millions of people just suddenly fall dead. Well, despite the brevity of the official records, we know the ancient Chinese society had proactive responses to epidemics. Emperors would perform special rituals and offer sacrifices to heaven and various gods to plead for relief from disease. They might also issue edicts waiving taxes or freeing prisoners, hoping to appease heaven's wrath. On a practical level, ancient Chinese medical understanding grew from these crises. Texts from the late Han and subsequent Three Kingdoms period discuss warm toxin epidemics. By the 3rd century CE, physicians like Zhang Zhongjing were writing about febrile epidemics and how to treat them with herbal formulations. There was even an early form of inoculation practiced against smallpox in China. It's a bit gross. They used to blow dried pox scabs into the nose. Well, that was centuries or two later. But the groundwork, a realization that surviving a disease could confer immunity, was hinted at in ancient times. Yet, like elsewhere, the Chinese also used quarantine measures. Historical anecdotes mention officials setting up checkpoints to prevent people from fleeing plague-ridden areas and spreading the illness. City gates could be closed and travel restricted during the worst outbreaks. In both India and China, you can see how cultural context shaped the reactions, can't you? Indian epics and Puranas reference plague-like conditions, occasionally as divine karma. And as for the Chinese Confucian ethics, well, they stress the emperor's duty to provide relief in disasters, lest he lose his legitimacy. And we all know what happens when they lose their legitimacy. Off with the heads, of course. While these societies did not usually personify plague as a specific god, like Mesopotamia did with Nergal, but they certainly viewed epidemic diseases as something beyond mere human control, either karmic or cosmic in origin. Still, their people were far from helpless. The evidence shows organized community efforts to care for the sick, rudimentary public health steps, and the preservation of lessons learned in medical writings. This all meant that when truly massive pandemics emerged, these regions had at least some knowledge to draw on, even if the scale of morality could still be staggering. Well, now with an understanding of how ancient Asia dealt with epidemics, let's turn to the classical Mediterranean world, where historians like Thucydides and physicians like Galen left some of the most detailed early accounts of pandemic disease. Thank you for your hard work, the ancient writers preserving that for us to enjoy. During the Peloponnesian War, in 430 BCE, the city of Athens was struck by a horrific summer plague. The Athenian Plague, as it's called, stands out as one of antiquity's most famous epidemic events, largely thanks to the vivid account written by the historian Thucydides, who actually lived through the entire thing. You see, at that time, Athens, crowded with citizens and war refugees sheltering behind its walls, hiding from the Spartans, became a breeding ground for disease. The sickness first appeared as Thucydides notes in the port of Piraeus, and then exploded through the congested city. It was said, maybe by hearsay, to have originated in Ethiopia and passed through Egypt and Persia, then arriving in Athens. Modern epidemiologists have debated the exact identity of the plague, with a typhoid fever being a strong candidate based on DNA evidence from a mass grave. But what matters most is the impact recorded by observers. So let's get back to Thucydides, because we are really lucky to have this account from his History of the Persian War. It provides a clinical description of the symptoms and a gripping portrayal of the social breakdown. Victims were suddenly seized by burning fevers, redness, inflammation in the eyes, and their tongues and throats bleeding or emitting an unusually foul breath. Many suffered violent coughing fits, vomiting, ulcerated bowels leading to fatal diarrhea. Those who survived the initial phase often experienced a terrible bout of delirium or exhaustion, sometimes losing fingers, eyes, or even memory. But that's if they were lucky to recover at all, if lucky is the word we use for it. This disease was highly lethal. It killed an estimated 1/3 of Athens' population in just 2 to 3 years. Not even the Athenian statesman Pericles, as great as he was spared. He succumbed in 429, along with many of his family members. With so many dead, the normal Athenian funeral customs completely collapsed. Thucydides recounts of how bodies were piled up without proper burial, and desperate people would shove aside others' corpses to cremate their own kin, or just resort to throwing them into mass graves. The fear of contagion made even close relatives reluctant to tend to the sick, or in the worst cases even mourn the deceased at all. Behind the physical toll, Thucydides emphasizes the psychological and moral impact of the dilemma, as death seemed to strike at random and the cure, well, there was no cure. Of course, this plunged the entire city into chaos. Lawlessness gripped the city. People stopped caring for social norms or justice, reasoning that life might be just too short for those things, so one should snatch whatever fleeting pleasure or advantage they could. The usual awe of gods and laws, it all diminished. After all, prayers and sacrifices had proven completely useless in stopping the plague, so what else were the ancient people to do? Now this sounds out of character for Athens. It was always celebrated for its piety and order, but it had now descended into a kind of chaos where, as Thucydides put it, people dared to do freely the things they would have hidden before. Whatever that means. Either way, they expected they would not live to face the consequences anyway. This breakdown of social order, the Greek term used is anomia, by the way, lawlessness, well, it had quite the effect on the fabric of Athenian society, and is thought to have undermined the unity and morale that was needed for the war effort against the Spartans. And indeed, some historians link the plague to Athens' eventual defeat. While not the sole cause, of course, it certainly robbed Athens of many soldiers and leaders, and eroded that social cohesion that Pericles had celebrated in his famous funeral oration just prior to the outbreak. And another thing, too, the Spartans were usually camped outside the walls, making siege, but as soon as the plague broke out, well, they figured they may as well just go home. The plague was going to do the heavy lifting for them. and it could kill many people within Sparta's walls than the Spartans could ever hope to do outside of them. But interestingly, Thucydides also notes a form of immunity. Those who survived the plague seem to have resistance to getting it again, and their blood, he speculated, might hold a cure for others. This recognition that survivors could nurse the sick without falling ill a second time is one of the earliest observations of immunity in history. It hints that careful observers like Thucydides were groping towards scientific insights, even amid all the horror. And one could imagine, too, the medical experts of the day just racking their brains, trying to figure out the best way to combat the horror. You must feel sorry for them a little bit, doing the best they can with what they had. All in vain. Maybe they knew that it was all in vain. I don't know. Anyway, the Plague of Athens certainly left its mark on the Greek consciousness. Later writers, such as the Roman poet Lucretius, used Thucydides' description as the basis for their own plague narratives. He ends his philosophical poem On the Nature of Things with a graphic account of the Athenian plague, showing the randomness of the violence of nature. As for the Athenians themselves, they built a new temple to Apollo, the god of healing. After the plague, they certainly needed that, and cults of healing gods like Asclepius gained more prominence. We also see in the philosophical texts that follow a grappling with the fragility of human life and communities. It is worth noting, too, that Athens was not the only Greek city to face an epidemic disaster. Earlier, in the mythic tales like Homer's Iliad, a plague is sent by Apollo on the Greek army besieging Troy, when the king Agamemnon offends the god's priest. This legendary plague, with arrows of Apollo carrying the disease, reflects how the Greeks imagined epidemics as divine punishment in their storytelling. In historical times, other cities too suffered outbreaks. Sparta experienced their own plague in 430 BCE as well, though it was far less deadly. And in 426, a renewed wave hit Athens. In the 4th century BCE, during the siege of Syracuse, 396, that is, Syracuse being in Sicily, right about the east coast actually, a Carthaginian invading force was almost annihilated by a sudden pestilence in their camp. The Carthaginian general Himilco lost most of his army to that plague, enabling the Syracusan Greeks under Dionysius to defeat the invaders. Greek medical writers, notably Hippocrates of the 5th century, also wrote treatises titled Epidemics, which, while not about one great plague event, will certainly document various disease outbreaks in different locales. The Hippocratic texts show Greek physicians attempting rational explanations for the disease: bad air, imbalances of humors, rather than attributing them to capricious gods. Now, while the science was a little bit off, give them credit for doing their best, it is interesting to see them in these earlier times move away from more divine explanations. They're trying to make sense of it in a secular manner. They're trying to think about more practical measures. And I suppose they deserve a pat on the head for that. Good job. Of course, this shift to naturalistic thinking was accelerated perhaps by the experiences of the Athenian plague, where traditional religion provided very little solution, and perhaps maybe just a tiny bit of solace. So to sum all of it up, classical Greece's encounter with the plague, epitomized by the Athenian epidemic, was quite a turning point. It showed that the devastating demographic impact that an epidemic could have on a city-state, and it could change the course of a major war, and provided a lesson in humility regarding human control over nature. The detailed records by Thucydides became a template for understanding plagues, scientifically and morally. So as we leave Greece to go over to Rome, we will see that the Romans, of course being the inheritors of Greek knowledge, had their own calamitous plagues to deal with, some of which they documented through the pens of physicians and bishops, giving us further insight into ancient pandemics. So we all know the Roman Empire at its height was a vast, interconnected realm. Now most of the time it was a strength, but when it came to infectious disease, well, interconnectedness becomes quite a weakness. Trade routes and legions could carry pathogens swiftly from one end of the empire to the other. Two particularly massive pandemics hit Rome in the first few centuries AD, testing one of the empire's resilience. First of all, the Antonine Plague in the 2nd century and the Plague of Cyprian in the 3rd. Each of these plagues killed millions across the empire and had far-reaching societal effects. So let's start with the Antonine Plague, 165 to 180. Named, of course, for the ruling dynasty of emperors Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, that being the Antonines. It's widely believed to have been an outbreak of smallpox, introduced into the Roman Empire by troops returning from a war in the Near East. The historian Cassius Dio, along with the physician Galen, both gave reports of this plague. Galen actually witnessed it himself in 168 in Rome and later in Asia Minor, and he also described the symptoms such as fever, diarrhea, a skin eruption covering the body with pustules. Sounds all pretty familiar for plagues. Modern analysis of these descriptions strongly points to smallpox, a highly contagious virus. The disease likely began around 165, when the Roman soldiers fighting in Mesopotamia against the Parthian Empire were struck with a strange illness. One legend claims the plague started in the city of Seleucia after the Romans opened a temple chest. A pretty unlikely story, but it does signify how sudden and baffling the outbreak was. From the Near East, the sickness spread rapidly westward. By 166 CE, it had reached Rome, the capital, perhaps carried by soldiers and merchants. As for the mortality, well, that was astonishing. Witnesses at the time noted that in many communities, 1 in 10 people perished. In the city of Rome itself, at the plague's peak of around 189, as many as 2,000 people were dying every day. We have a report of this daily death toll from a church source some century later, likely drawing on the city annals. We might have lost the annals, but we still have that church source. The empire's total population at the time was about 75 million. Historians estimate that the Antonine Plague killed somewhere between 5 and 10 million. Now that makes it one of the deadliest outbreaks on record, if we're going to trust the figures of the estimate. Marcus Aurelius, who was also a Stoic philosopher I'm sure you know, wrote in his meditations during these years reflections on the brevity of life, perhaps influenced by seeing so much death all around him. But don't think that the upper class was spared. Legions of the aristocracy died, leaving gaps in local governing councils across the provinces. This, of course, led to a shortfall of experienced administrators and even candidates for office in some towns. Economically, the plague caused labor shortages on farms and in workshops. With fewer taxpayers and soldiers, the imperial government felt the strain. Marcus Aurelius had to recruit slaves, gladiators, even mercenaries from Germania to replenish the army. A Tell you what, though, if you're going to replenish an army, a bunch of 7-foot-tall German barbarians is probably a pretty good idea. Anyway, offensive campaigns on the frontiers were postponed or abandoned completely, either because the troops were just too few, or the ones that they had were, well, too sick to fight. But we always see signs of religious shifts. Some Romans, fearful and seeking answers, turned to new deities or philosophies. The cult of Apollo Medicus, Apollo as healer, was promoted. A statue of Apollo Alexakos, the averter of evil, was erected in one town with hopes of divine intervention. The psychological impact of the Antonine Plague was understandably quite immense. When one contemporary wrote that the epidemic destroyed not only a few people, but rampaged across whole cities and destroyed them like a beast. Many must have felt civilization itself was under assault by some unseen entity. Yet as we know, the empire did survive, albeit changed. When the plague finally receded around 180, it left a more fearful population and perhaps an erosion of faith in the old pagan rituals, which had not stopped the calamity. Notably, the growth of Christianity in the next century has been partly attributed to these plagues. Christians often cared for the sick, buried the dead, and they earned admiration for their compassion. With the admiration, of course, came a few converts, in contrast to the sometimes indifferent responses from the officials. Though this trend is more clearly seen in the later 3rd century plague, seeds were planted in the Antonine crisis. Barely a century later came the Plague of Cyprian, 249 to 270, which was, if anything, even more devastating in its prolonged fury. This epidemic is named after St. Cyprian, the bishop of Carthage in Roman North Africa, who left quite a detailed account of the plague's symptoms and moral impact in his sermons and work titled On Mortality. The illness began around Easter of 250, reportedly in the region of Ethiopia, similar to the Athenian plague's supposed origin, and spread northward into the Roman world. It is described as affecting the entire known world at the time, which suggests a pandemic reaching beyond just the Roman Empire's borders. In Alexandria, Carthage, Rome, even as far as the Persian Empire, people were struck down by this mysterious illness. Cyprian's description is pretty harrowing. The plague caused relentless diarrhea and vomiting, a high fever, throat ulcers that rendered victims unable to speak or swallow, conjunctival bleeding, that is, blood coming from the eyes, and in some cases, gangrene of the extremities. Many sufferers went blind or deaf. The onslaught was so sudden and the body so ravaged that Cyprian wrote, the pain in the eyes, and limbs so weak that some would flee their own beds only to collapse. Death often followed swiftly after a short period of intense suffering. Modern medical historians have proposed everything from viral hemorrhagic fever, like Ebola, to pandemic influenza or cholera for this disease, but no consensus exists. What is clear is its infectiousness and high fatality. At its height, the plague of Cyprian was said to kill 5,000 people a day, and that's just in Rome alone. A number are quoted by the bishop Dionysius of Alexandria and other sources. This figure, even if exaggerated, indicates the impression of an apocalyptic level of mortality. In the city of Alexandria, one contemporary account claims 2/3 of the population fell ill at one point or another. The plague raged in waves for nearly 20 years, periodically flaring up in different regions. It coincided with the crisis of the 3rd century, a time when the Roman Empire was also reeling from civil wars, barbarian invasions, and a complete economic collapse. It felt like the end of the world for sure, for those who had to live through it. Well, Cyprian himself certainly seemed to think that. But what about societal reactions? Well, they were telling. In many cities, basic services completely broke down. In Alexandria, the bishop Dionysius wrote that the rich fled to their country estates, leaving the poor to die, and that often bodies lay unburied in the streets. A kind of social paralysis had set in, born of fear. Cyprian, however, urged his fellow Christians not to recoil but to double down on caring for the sick, not only their fellow believers but also their pagan neighbors. This charitable response, of course, won the aforementioned admiration that we've talked about, drawing more people toward the Christian faith. And it was quite comforting that they would preach of hope in an afterlife amid the present horrors. Kind of takes the edge off the impending doom. Meanwhile, some pagan authorities reacted by scapegoating. The Emperor Decius, shortly before, had initiated harsh persecutions of Christians in 250, partly perhaps in a bid to appease the gods he believed were angry and causing the plague. Later, when Decius died, ironically not from plague but in battle, and further emperors came in and went in quick succession, the stability of the empire was in complete ruin. The plague certainly did exacerbate manpower shortages in the legions, making it difficult to fend off external threats, and there were plenty of them. But it also disrupted agriculture and trade, contributing to famine conditions in some provinces. There is an archaeological discovery in Luxor, that's quite poignant. That is, ancient Thebes in Egypt. It shows the desperate measures taken. A large bonfire site and lime kilns were found, evidently used to burn and sanitize the remains of Cyprian plague victims on an industrial scale. The fact that a grand funerary complex was repurposed as nothing more than a mass cremation site. Well, if that doesn't speak volumes about how overwhelmed the normal systems had become, I don't know what will. Well, as for the site itself, it was subsequently abandoned, likely acquiring a sinister reputation as a ground tainted by death. But from a cultural perspective, people saw the plague of Cyprian through the lens of their own beliefs. Pagans blamed Christians or foreign cults angering the gods, and Christians, like Cyprian, interpreted the plague as a test of faith, an opportunity to witness one's moral fortitude and the transient nature of life. In one of his sermons, Cyprian admonished not to grieve for plague victims, who as Christians would be in heaven, but rather to use the crisis to show love for others. Such attitudes not only provided comfort but helped strengthen the organizational role of the church. When the plague finally waned in the 270s, the empire emerged battered and bruised. Some historians argue that the population loss contributed to the empire's shift towards a more regional and less urbanized economy, and it accelerated changes such as the fortification of cities and the increased authority of military commanders in the provinces. The plague of Cyprian thus was both a humanitarian disaster, but also a catalyst for transformation. It is worth noting, however, that plagues did not disappear after the 3rd century, not out of the woods yet. There were smaller outbreaks in the 4th and 5th centuries. For example, an epidemic in 444 CE in Britain, recorded by chroniclers, and occasional outbreaks in the Eastern Roman Empire. However, none were as globally devastating until the next great pandemic in the 6th century, which we will now turn to. Long before the Black Death of the 14th century, there was another pandemic on comparable scale, the Plague of Justinian, also called the Justinianic Plague, often termed the first plague pandemic. This series of plague waves began in 541 CE, during the reign of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I, and recurred intermittently until about 750. It is the first unmistakable appearance of bubonic plague, Yersinia pestis, in the historical record. Because of improved documentation and the nature of the disease, we've got quite a clearer picture of the origin, spread, and effects of this pandemic. According to contemporary accounts, the plague originated somewhere in the east. Some sources say the edges of India, or perhaps the steppe of China, and modern research says it may have incubated in the rodent populations of Central Asia. It then traveled along trade routes westward. The first outbreak hit the Byzantine garrison town of Pelusium in Egypt's Nile Delta in 541. Egypt, of course, was a logical entry point. It was a breadbasket of the empire and a crossroad of the African-Asian trade. And so, from Egypt, the disease spread to Constantinople by early 542. The Byzantine historian Procopius gives a pretty gripping eyewitness account of what followed. He describes people developing the classic plague symptoms: delirium, sudden fever, and most tellingly, swellings in the groin, armpits, or behind the ears, the buboes that turned black and oozed pus. Pretty gross, I know. Some victims fell into a coma. Others became frenzied with hallucinations. If it was me, I'd want the coma. I wouldn't want to have to deal with that sort of stuff while I'm awake. Just put me in the coma. Of course, many died within days. A few lingered, suffering for a few weeks. Procopius even notes that while some infected individuals could recover, others died almost immediately after the first signs. The sight of these painful buboes left little doubt that this was the dreaded bubonic plague, a disease not previously documented in the Mediterranean lands. Its true home, of course, was among the rodent colonies in more distant regions. Of course, the plague in Constantinople was completely devastating. Procopius claims at its peak the city saw 10,000 deaths per day. Modern historians suspect that to be a little bit inflated, but even if that true figure was a fraction of it, it's still pretty staggering, you must admit. By Procopius's estimate, over 1/3 of the capital's inhabitants perished in a few months. As bodies accumulated, regular burial services failed. And there is a gruesome description, too, of how the emperor's men had to stuff corpses into towers or fortifications, or load them on ships to be dumped at sea, simply to keep up with the death toll. Of course, imagine the smell. It was everywhere, and the constant wail of mourners came with it, for those who still bothered to do the mourning. Emperor Justinian himself, well, he ended up catching the plague, but surprise, surprise, against the odds he recovered. Some saw that as proof of divine favor, others as a kind of dark irony. Well, from Constantinople, the plague radiated out across Europe, the Middle East, and possibly into Asia and Africa. Over the next 2 centuries, waves of this plague would erupt. It reached the Italian peninsula, thwarting some of Justinian's wars to reconquer the West. It swept through Gaul, the Frankish territories, and even as far as the British Isles. The chronicler, Gregory of Tours, in Frankish Gaul, wrote of a terrible plague around 543, in which swollen glands were the telltale sign, and cities like Clermont were emptied of inhabitants. the eastern Mediterranean and Near East were repeatedly scourged. The plague hit Antioch, Alexandria, Jerusalem, Persian cities, and so on. In the year 544, the Persian Shah Khosrow I was said to have observed the plague decimating his armies and agreed to a truce with the Byzantines. So pestilence achieved what in diplomacy could not, I suppose, holding a war, albeit temporarily. Well, you take what you can get. In descriptions by John of Ephesus, the Evagrius Scholasticus, two other contemporaries mention whole villages being wiped out, and survivors wandering in a daze, believing that the end of time had truly come. The long-term effects of the Justinian pandemic were pretty profound. It struck during a crucial period when Emperor Justinian was attempting to restore Roman imperial glory by reconquering lost western provinces. The sudden loss of population and tax revenue hampered by these campaigns, historians have argued that the Byzantine Empire was significantly weakened by that too. The armies had trouble finding recruits too. So many men had just died, and the empire's finances were drained by both the cost of war and the emergency public health response. Talk about mass grave digging, cleanup, charity, that sort of thing. It all has a price tag in the end. Some scholars even link this plague to the later Arab conquest of the 7th century. A weakened Byzantine and Persian state, with diminished manpower and resources, was less able to resist the rapid expansion of the new Islamic Caliphate from the 630s onwards. While many factors were at play, the plague's attrition is often cited as an undermining factor for both the Byzantine and Sasanian Persian empires, which were of course the top players of late antiquity. Now, culturally, the Justinian plague reinforced apocalyptic beliefs. This 6th century was also marked by unusual climate events. A volcanic eruption in 536, causing cooling and crop failures. So yeah, people probably felt that nature was certainly in upheaval. The gods flipping the monopoly board upside down sort of thing. Procopius, who elsewhere wrote quite rationally, lapsed into moralizing in his secret writings. He insinuated that the plague was divine punishment for Emperor Justinian's sins, even calling Justinian a demon responsible for the evil. You better hope that the emperor does not see that public journal. Well, you'd hope it's not public, private journal rather. The church organized processions and prayers. One famous story from Rome in 590 describes Pope Gregory and the Great leading a penitential procession and supposedly seeing an apparition of the Archangel Michael sheathing his sword atop Hadrian's mausoleum, signaling the end of suffering. That also gave the tomb its later name, by the way, Castle St. Angelo, the Castle of the Holy Angel. Well, over the roughly 200-year course of the first pandemic, estimates of total death are pretty speculative. But the toll was certainly in the tens of millions, across Eurasia, Africa, everywhere. Some regions took generations to recover demographically. For instance, the city of Constantinople might have lost 40% of its population. And with subsequent waves every 10 to 15 years, well, population growth was quite stunted. But on the other hand, and just like in later times, those who survived found their economic position quite improved. With labor scarce, wages could rise, land was more available. A bit of a foreshadowing what would happen after the Black Death. Society also became more localized. Long-distance trade shrunk for a time due to fear of contagion, and the breakdown of networks contributing to an early medieval economy was quite a bit more insular. By 750, the plague finally faded out. Why? We don't know. It may have been the decline of easy trade routes or evolutionary changes in the plague bacterium or its host reservoirs. Well, lucky for the people of that time, they enjoyed a respite from global pandemic until at least the 14th century. But the collective memory of those ancient plagues did not disappear. In the Middle East, early Islamic historians recorded the accounts of the Plague of Amwas, that is Amwas in Palestine, 639 CE, and others, ensuring that even in later centuries people looked back on those events for guidance. Now, just for an example, Islamic law incorporated ideas about not leaving or entering plague zones, echoing earlier practices. And well, there you have it. The long-forgotten plagues of the old ancient world. Pretty cool, huh? Well, not go for the people who lived through them, but you from your comfy chair, along with me, looking back on the horrors of that time. Well, I suppose it's good to learn about. Well, let me thank my top-tier patrons and supporters. Kimberly, Christine, Sally Ember, Susan, Cameron Legitmus, Charlene, Lynn Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Dalbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Nephthys, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Vanita, Claire, Cortese, and Carol. Thank you. All right. Well, that's enough for tonight, I think. An hour and 2 minutes. All right, that'll do us for this topic. Of course, I could talk more about it, but, that's enough. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all. Thank you for joining me, and I will see you whenever you feel inclined to return. You know where I'll be. Good night for now.